Welcome, everybody, to the Super Story podcast with your hosts, Houston Howard, Brad Lusher, and myself, T-Rev. Government name is Travis Carter. And we are here to make your creative super, your brand super, your business super with super insights. And I will say this, folks, make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood. Daniel Burnham said that. And today we're going to be talking about what is a super story. So Houston, let's talk. Brad, let's talk about that. What's the difference between a super story and a story? How can
before we get there, who's this Daniel Burnham fellow that you talked who did he play for? That's what I want to know. Who did he play for?
Daniel Burnham?
Yeah.
He didn't play for anyone. I think he's to be honest, I'm going to tell myself, I saw the quote.
You just like
fell in love with it. I'm like, so I'm not even going to look who this guy is.
So he could have played for the Browns. You just don't know. You just don't know. Well, like that's.
I think he played for the Browns.
Okay, I like that. I like that. So, well, let's start first by talking about our virtual backgrounds. For anybody watching on YouTube, we do have interesting virtual backgrounds going on in every episode. We talk about why we chose the things that we chose. And so let's start with you, T-Rev. Why do you have the atomic bomb going off behind you?
I'm thinking about the atomic bomb. If you looked at it, it probably would be a small package if you saw it before it exploded. But what it releases, the power it releases, the spread, you think about that. I want it to represent what I think people's stories, how far they can go.
I like it. And Brad, what do you got there behind?
I got a classic fairy tale story going on. You see, there's some 20th century folks there looking out at the magical kingdom behind them,
Interesting.
So you can create a fairy tale fantasy anywhere.
I like it. Okay, cool. So my virtual background actually is a character called Elric of Melniboné. Elric of Melniboné is a part of a book series called the Eternal Champion series, written by a guy named Michael Moorcock. Even though that sounds like a porn name, he's actually an author. And, he wrote a series called the Eternal Champion series. And my first exposure to super story type things really was probably Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit when I was a kid. Grew into Star Wars. But when I was in high school, I picked up the Eternal Champion series, and this guy had 20 some novels that all crossed over in crazy ways that told different stories, but at the same time they were very interconnected. He produced music that he had a band called Hawkwind that he tied the music into the books, and that was really when I became my almost adult self really started getting into the art and the creativity and the tactics of how to create this stuff. Actually, my senior research paper in high school, before I graduated, I wrote. It was a comparison and contrast of the super story worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien and Michael Moorcock, and how they were similar, how they were different, and the tactics they used to be able. I didn't use the term super story back then, obviously. But that was actually what my senior research paper was about. I've been trying to find that to dig it up to reread it. It's probably terrible, but it was interesting. When Trav, when you were a senior in high school and you were dating all the girls and doing all the fun stuff, and Brad, when you had your garage band and doing all the stuff, nerdy Houston was comparing and contrasting the story worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien and Michael Moorcock. So so we all take different paths in life, I suppose. But anyway, so that's why I chose this guy as my virtual background, sort of an homage to that book series that was sort of a seminal.
Yeah, he reminds me of The Witcher.
Very Witcher-esque. He's probably more moody and brooding than Geralt, but but you can definitely see similarities between the Witcher. You could probably compare and contrast J.R.R. Tolkien and Michael Moorcock and The Witcher, all three, all at the same time, if you wanted to. Very similar things that kind of flow together. But he had a sword. Elric has a sword that, as he stabs people, it eats their souls. And then that's the way Elric he remains alive by eating the souls of other people through his sword. But he's actually a good guy, and creates an interesting conflict of how to do that, right? So kind of interesting. Yeah, good dark brooding, fantasy.
That's a good choice, though. Good
choice.
Yeah.
He always wrote everything in the genre called dark fantasy that was interesting. I mean, J.R.R. Tolkien wrote high fantasy, light fantasy, right? That was very optimistic. But Michael Moorcock he's an atheist, and so his stuff was very dark and sort of nihilistic. Again, I'm rehashing my research paper from me being a senior in high school, but that was an interesting sort of difference between the two. But really an interesting book series if anybody's interested in it. But like 20 books long. The first book I got was a book called Von Beck, and I didn't even know it was part of a bigger series. And then that was my entry point into sort of that larger universe, and then it continued to spin off from there. So thus my love of giant interconnected entertainment devices. And so once we started this podcast, we realized that though a lot of people are listening to the podcast and watching the vidcast on YouTube, because they've read our books, they've seen our keynotes, they've been part of our content or part of our workshops or whatever. But then there's a lot of people that probably don't even know what a super story is, and so we wanted to take this episode and really dive in to just the basic, what the heck are we doing and why are we doing it, just like Trav said. So generally speaking, the difference between a story and a super story is pretty vast, right? And pretty important to make that distinction. How would you guys explain the difference of story as opposed to a super story?
I think for me, it starts with story world, just that immediate elevation of, not just telling a story about a character, but let's look at a whole world that the character lives in. Sure. And let's elevate that up, expand it out, and really set up parameters that allow that story world to take on a life of its own. And it can birth multiple characters and multiple storylines that can live on for a long period of time and kind of evolve and grow almost like a living organism. Sure. And I think a lot of our favorite entertainment kind of capture, it has that, like you're saying, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, these types of folks that are creating big time story worlds that you can really just live in and you can hang out in them. Sure. And you could spend years creating different types of stories in those worlds. So I think it kind of starts there for me.
What about you, Trav? What do you see the difference between story and super story?
What's interesting? Let me preface my comments with this. Before we would lose the writers of rom-coms or romance novels or stories like that, there's super story in this conversation for you guys, because we've mentioned Tolkien and these fantasy worlds, which are great to create a super story, which I'm going to define myself. But what I think a super story is simply, no matter what genre it's in, the story lends itself to longevity.
Sure.
Meaning that I'll echo some of the things you mentioned, Brad. A lot of characters, interesting characters, a lot of layers within, whether the world is fantasy or reality. There's a lot of places that you can go. There's groups of people that you can follow, that you can root for. There's multiple storylines that can intertwine and can exist outside of just your book, outside of just your film, outside of just your TV show. This story goes beyond any platform, and it can be consumed on multiple platforms,
Sure.
and people are just interested. How can I get more? How can I get more? That's what makes a story from just, hey, I like that story, I'm done with it, shut the book. No, I want to go on. So that's what I think of super story.
Yeah, 100%. I think just that word super, right? Just defining that word super means bigger than one, more than one, right? And so that's really really all we're talking about. And I do think certain genres lend itself more, but I'm very bullish on the fact that that every story in every genre can be transmediated, can be turned into a super story. You just have to find the right entry points, right? And we deal with that stuff all the time. And it's the principles that you learn from Marvel, the principles that you learn from Star Wars, the principles that you learn from Lord of the Rings or whatever it is. If you extract those principles in the right way and apply them to your romantic comedy or your character piece or the art house piece, those same principles apply. So I always like to liken it to the laws of entertainment. There's what we see from Marvel and Star Wars and these sort of the bigger IP, Harry Potter and things like that, is that they're proving and tapping into laws of entertainment and laws of audience that just work, and seeing what audiences respond to, not just in a trend way, but over the course of, say, 40, 50 years way, ultimately proves that there is these laws of entertainment, the laws of audiences that they've tapped into. And just like they're tapping into it, anybody can tap into it. The art house director can tap into it. The poet can tap into it. The community playwright can tap into it. The hip hop artist can tap into it. You just have to tap into that same law. So, for example, if we look up in the sky and see a Boeing 777 flying through the sky, that plane, that 777, is utilizing the law of lift to supersede the law of gravity, right? So there's two laws at play. The law of gravity keeps us to the ground. The law of lift allows airplanes to fly because it supersedes the law of gravity, right? Which is awesome. So we see that, we can say, "Ooh, that's super cool. That giant plane is using those two laws to fly. I wish I could do that, but I can't do that because I don't have a zillion dollars to make a giant plane like that." But we can take a sheet of paper that is free and fold it in a very specific way and throw it across the room. And that tiny little paper airplane is going to use the exact same law of lift to supersede the exact same law of gravity. They're utilizing the same laws. The only difference is budget and how far it can go, things like that. Of course, there's differences, but it's utilizing the same laws. One of my favorite examples of this is by one of my favorite filmmakers, Kevin Smith. And Kevin Smith sort of broke out in the mid '90s. There was a big glut of independent filmmakers that it was an indie boom in the '90s, and they all sort of rushing into the film festival at the time. Kevin Smith was able to cut through because he didn't just make cool, talky indie films like Clerks, Mallrats, Chasing Amy, things like that. They were all very low budget. Clerks, I think, was $30,000. That black and white. He put it on a credit card. Really just kind of hustled his way through this thing, and but very talky, all set at a convenience store in New Jersey, and very, very super indie. What he did differently than all those other filmmakers was not necessarily be a better filmmaker than everybody else or a better writer than everybody else, though he's very talented. He began to interconnect all his stories, and so the characters in Clerks then showed up in Mallrats, and Mallrats took place in the same town that Clerks took place in, and then Chasing Amy was then connected to those characters, and he just kept spinning off and creating this shared universe of characters, all in very low budget, very niche, talky, offbeat humor films. Awesome. And how did he get the idea to do that? He grew up a fan of Marvel Comics. Right? He would read Marvel Comics and Spider-Man and Reed Richards and Daredevil, and everybody would know each other because they all lived in Hell's Kitchen, right? And he loved how those things crossed over. And so, but he didn't say, I need to go make a big superhero movie in order to do that. No, he made a super talky, raunchy, weird black and white movie that used those same principles. He used the paper airplane after looking at that 777. I think that's super inspirational, Travis.
Yeah. And that goes to the point. I appreciate you bringing that up first. For a lot of writers, there's segments of writers, creators out there, even musicians out there that are thinking when super story, when they're thinking it's just fantasy, it is just Marvel. You bring up Kevin Smith. That's an awesome way of how he took a simple storyline, but created a world.
Sure.
Like Brad, you mentioned that. He expanded that world. It had many legs where it could travel. And great thing about Super Story is, I think I know that it would help a person make more money. We want to live off of our art. So if you have these multiple stories and platforms, some of them may flop, some of them may not hit.
Sure.
But a couple of them can, if you have more stories. And then when those hit, then sometimes people will go back and go watch things that they wouldn't have watched
100%.
or
Sure.
gotten involved in. So it's a very important concept, I think, for from big studios to the starving artists. Even though I hate that word, we want to help you not be starving artists. But
yeah, I'm a fan of well-fed artists, right? Like that's we still want to be artists, but we want to actually have a full stomach. Brad, did you grow up with any particular fan interest in multi-platform entertainment?
So what's interesting for me, the entry point was a little different. So growing up in a Christian household, my family would, my time to sit down for bed, my dad would open the Bible and be reading little Bible stories, about things that Jesus was doing or people from the Old Testament, things like that. And then the first crossover experience that I had was there was a franchise called Superbook that CBN produced, and it was a really cool little animated series for kids. But what was awesome about it is, so in the story, it was a few kids that there's like a Bible in their house, and they also had a little robot pal that would hang out with them.
Right.
So they're like in the modern day, or sort of modern day because they had a robot. And what would happen is each episode they would open the Bible, which was I guess called the Superbook, and when they'd open it, it would like spin them back into this like alternate time loop where they would like show up back in Bible times. Okay. And so then I was now seeing a crossover of like, I knew these little cartoon character kids and like their life and their robot. And then all of a sudden they would show up and like, there's like Jesus in the background, like doing something in a story that I had read in the Bible. And then
speaking of little kids showing up. Right.
Yeah,
as little kids appear. Yeah. That's awesome.
That was timely. That was
so this is good. Yeah. It's not like this is orchestrated, but part of the Zoom sessions, right, as we're quarantined, is we do all this stuff from home, right? So we and we're a very family run business. So we like to have our kids sort of wandering around randomly in every shot. So that's awesome. So I love it. But
that's awesome.
She was like a ghost appearing out of a wall.
I know. Right?
That was amazing, as you said. It was perfectly timed.
It was perfectly timed. So the people just listen to the podcast, the audio version of the podcast. My 6-year-old Soraya Praise, she just popped into the screen. So there you go. She just launched her own YouTube channel, Soraya's Playhouse. Go check it out. She put
love that
little plug.
Love that.
I don't even remember how much I have.
Yeah, so she's excited because she has 26 subscribers. So she's trending upwards. So
I'm one of those subscribers.
So I'm the richest little girl I bet that's ever lived.
She's the richest little girl ever. So that's what she says. Well, we haven't seen the YouTube checks yet, but I like that confession she's making.
I love it.
So anyway, keep going, Brad. Keep jamming.
So that was my first experience of crossover, of basically having fiction crossing over into historical stories that I had known.
Sure.
And then as I became a teenager, there was a book I remember reading called Johnny Tremain.
Okay.
So I had been learning about the American Revolution and early American history in school. So I understood the colonies and fighting against Britain and all this
Sure.
and that. I knew those stories. And then now I got this book called Johnny Tremain. It was a fictional book reading about this young guy working as an apprentice at like a blacksmith shop in early Boston, and then in this story he starts getting wrapped up in the American Revolution, and so then all of a sudden now I'm reading about this fictional guy with his issues going on, like his hand got burned at the blacksmith shop and like different stuff, but now he's getting wrapped up in the American Revolution, and so then it was kind of blending in fiction with history. Sure. And it just like really opened my mind to the different possibilities in storytelling.
I love it. I love it.
I just fell in love with those types of crossovers,
and really the Bible, I think, is one of the first, when we talk about transmedia, the Bible is really, one of the first earliest versions of transmedia in and of itself, right? I mean, the Bible is separate books that are all compiled together as part of one like giant story, right? And
that's even cool because it's multiple authors,
Oh yeah, multiple authors over multiple centuries,
generations,
right? Like that's really over multiple countries, right? It really is an incredible thing if you think about it. But especially like I think all of us grew up in an era where multi-platform entertainment really began to boom. And it, whether it was Batman, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Star Wars, He-Man, G.I. Joe, reading comic books, watching Saturday morning cartoons, all that stuff that was a part of our childhood. When I got into Hollywood, I wanted to basically make the things that I was a fan of, right? I want, and if I grew up a fan of being able to read the comics and watch the cartoon and then read the book and play with the toys and things like that, like why wouldn't we just want to lean into that with our own entertainment ourselves? And so
I used to love all the Scooby-Doo episodes, where the different comic book heroes would show up, and I remember the one with the what's the basketball team?
The Harlem Globetrotters.
Yeah, Globetrotters.
Right? Really incredible. And this was actually sort of a existential crisis for me as a kid. I remember thinking about this, and it because when Scooby-Doo had Batman and Robin, then I remember thinking, 12-year-old Houston was thinking, how can they exist in that same world, right? Like, because Batman is in Gotham City and Scooby-Doo is set loosely in Santa Barbara, but it's a very West Coast thing, right? And so I remember thinking, how did they get like across the country? Like, what did they take the bat plane? Like, how is that going? But I always knew Batman as Gotham City was essentially like a replacement for New York City in that DC universe, right? But then when
Chicago, wasn't it?
I thought it was always New York City, right? I always thought East Coast New York City. That's like, and I may be wrong about that, but that was in my brain. That was what I had it as. And then when the Harlem Globetrotters showed up on Scooby-Doo, then I thought the Harlem Globetrotters and Batman and Robin and Scooby-Doo all live in the same universe. But if the Harlem Globetrotters are from Harlem, which is in New York City, and Gotham is a replacement for New York City, then Gotham can't be New York City. But then where is Gotham? And I remember like 12-year-old Houston just being vexed with this continuity issue, right? But it didn't lessen my enthusiasm for it. We always love crossover, right? I mean, crossover in general is just is an exciting thing for fans. Whether it's in TV, crossover episodes are always the highest rated episodes. Whether they're the Chicago PD, Chicago Fire, Chicago Med, NBC crossover events, all the SVUs crossover, Legends of Tomorrow, Supergirl, Arrow, Flash, crossover events. In comics, those crossover events, super popular, obviously, right? We love crossover. Look at the Avengers movies, the crossover movies that you see in that regard.
I think it's because, early on, when comic books were really getting popular, it's like before they were popular, that wasn't like a coveted writing gig to get, like you'd have writers that failed out as Hollywood screenwriters or failed out as novelists, but they would get these gigs writing for comics. But because it was a little bit lower scale, they had the freedom of exploring and kind of creating different ways to weave stories together. But then as basically a generation of people grew up reading the comics, then you now had a more legit enterprise of becoming a comic writer.
Sure.
And then as they became more popular, now they were able to cross over as writers into more mainstream media. And so then you started slowly seeing crossovers become something that people were really looking forward to.
Sure.
Trying to incorporate as much as they could.
Speaking of Elric of Melniboné and the Michael Moorcock series, here's the book. You can't see it because I'll turn my virtual back.
Put it in front of your face.
There we go. Look at there, right in front of it. It's called Quorum: The Coming of Chaos, and this is part of that same book series, but it's a different story world, different characters. Everything's different. But Elric of Melniboné shows up in Quorum and the Coming of Chaos, and I remember, like in high school, I just like geeked out about this. I'm like such a nerd about this stuff. But I remember thinking, oh my god, this is so awesome! Like this character that I love from all these Elric books is now crossing over in the Quorum books. And it was awesome. Like we love this stuff. The same way in music, Travis, is we love it when artists feature on other artists' tracks, right? Especially two artists that we love coming together, and or unexpected crossover, like we saw with Lil Nas X and Billy Ray Cyrus with Old Town Road, right? So it's been a staple of entertainment forever, it seems like.
Yeah, and you know what? It's we're talking about continuity issues. People want to see continuity, and I think the story aspect, even like you're talking about music, we're talking about continuity that gives someone to follow, something to check, and people appreciate that. I was thinking about my brother, Tay Smalls, who made an album called "Who Killed My Mama," and because if you guys don't know out there, unfortunately, when I was 10, my mother was murdered, and we never found the guy until 33 years later. That's a whole story, but very rich story.
You just dropped a story seed right there.
I just stopped a story seed. So my brother comes to me with the album "Who Killed My Mama," and I was like, well, you need to let 1-3 Creative create a super story for that. That's awesome. I like what you're doing here. So I listened to the album, and where the songs were great and fun and commercial, there was no storyline in there.
Sure.
He had one song about our mom, but I was like, okay. I said, if you're going to have this concept, let's create the story of how you were affected, how you've been hurt, challenged, gone crazy, ended up in prison, and how you're doing music now. And then, because then he also shot some documentaries. He was going to the house that we used to live in. He knocked on the door. The people opened it. They let him tour the house where we lived at, and they all hugged and cried. So he had this multi-platform. He had a story world here that spanned over 30-something years that takes place in the Bay Area of California to Ohio. But he had a real opportunity, and listen here, folks, he had a real opportunity to create a story that people would follow from track 1 to track 2. Some of his tracks are about, hey, let me see that booty bounce and all that stuff. I'm like,
wow.
That doesn't have nothing to do with mom. I said, now,
right. Yeah, sure.
You could weave that in on how you met that girl that did those things, but she was the wrong one, and see on your journey, but it had no continuity, no flow. But there was a real opportunity, and that's why I think super story is so important in every art form and genre. You can conceptualize, create, and that leads me to a question I think maybe our audience may be thinking, Houston, Brad, to create a super story, are people out there thinking, hey, I already have a story, how can it be super, or how should I conceptualize from the beginning? Are there some ingredients, or are there some simple tips to start a super story?
Sure. I mean, I think Brad hit on it earlier with really just looking at the story world first and making sure that you have not just an interesting character, but an interesting world that your character lives in. So it's
Mm,
awesome to have Batman, but it's also great to have Gotham because Gotham creates that story potential that you can use to spin off other stories, right? I think practically within that story world, how to create the story world is making sure when you develop a character, you develop groups of characters
mhm.
and don't look at individuals, but look at groups, right? And so instead of like one boxer, it becomes lots of boxers, or one warrior. Now you're looking at a whole bunch of warriors, right? And that creates story potential for you to spin off of. I mean, I looked at a tweet last night. That said, after, let me just pull this up real quick, and it was about Wonder Woman. A Wonder Woman spinoff is going to be centered on the Amazons, right?
Mm,
Which may actually come out before Wonder Woman 3, right? And so, which is great. What this does is it shows that instead of just having one kick-ass, cool, superhero woman, now we have a group of awesome kick-ass superhero women of the Amazonians, right? Which
right.
allow you to do all the Wonder Woman stories individually, but also now you can explore outside of Wonder Woman
Yep.
to get all those. Now they may not all be feature films, they may not all be TV series, but maybe you get comic books or novels or
Right.
mobile games or poems or a play or something else about them. So I think practically story world and then groups of characters in your story world is going to sort of create that potential for you, or at least some of it
Yeah.
to get started.
I think, yeah, you just hit on that where it's, initially we were talking about crossing over characters and storylines, but I think then crossing over between platforms, that's the next level. That's where the super story excels. So I remember as a kid, I was a huge fan of the Dick Tracy cartoons.
Sure.
I would rush home to watch them after school. And then, unfortunately, there was a scheduling change, and they changed they basically brought the time it would air an hour earlier. And so then I would always get home right as the credits were rolling, and I'd be like, "Oh my god!" And I even remember there was a day off from school. It was like a holiday, and I was like, "Yes, I get to watch Dick Tracy." But then, as I turned it on the time it should have been on, I realized, "Oh wait, it's a holiday, so the scheduling on TV is different now." And so I
Sure.
was like, "I'll never be able to watch Dick Tracy again."
Yeah.
But then I found out, wait, they have comics.
Sure.
So then now I was able to go to comics and enjoy Dick Tracy. And then in a similar way with Garfield, I met Garfield first in comic strips, and then was so pleasantly surprised to see, yeah, I can experience these stories on cartoons as well. So I think it's finding your story, making it big enough with a lot of characters and storylines and in that story world, but then exploring it in different ways to reach different levels of audiences.
100%. I mean, I think that creating multiple entry points into the IP is so vital, and that's really what a transmediated model or a super story model really, like, one of the biggest value propositions is exactly what you
Right.
said. I mean, my entry point for Breaking Bad wasn't the TV show. I played a Flash based mobile game that dealt with Badger and Jesse Pinkman going on some side mission to
Mm,
recapture a bag of drugs that somebody ripped them off for, and it was sort of like almost a choose your own adventure flash based comic style game. And I'd never heard of Breaking Bad before, or I heard of it, but I never watched the TV show. And that one little mobile game was that intrigued me enough with those two characters that then next time I saw Breaking Bad on TV, I checked it out, right? And that was something more than a commercial would have done or a billboard would have done. It was actually an entry point using a different platform that engaged me into the story. And so I always liken you look at your IP or your brand as a house, right? The traditional way into the house is through the front door. But that's not the only way to get into a house. The way you get all the different ways to get into a house, your garage door, the back door, the windows, the chimney, right? Like Santa always comes in the chimney. There's all these other ways to get into the house. And so what we want to do in a super story model is we don't want to just open the front door, which is the way you do business typically, right? If you're a filmmaker, your front door is film. If you're a music producer, your front door is going to be your music. If you're a poet, the front door is your poem. That's awesome. Do that. That's your driving platform. That's the passion. That's the mastery that you have. But what we want to do is we want to open all those different points of entry to let different people into those houses. Because what we have to recognize, and I think we could all agree to this, Travis, is that everybody doesn't like everything, right? Not everybody reads comics.
Right.
Not everybody watches TV. Not everybody plays games, right? Not everybody does everything. And so if you're a video game creator and all you make are video games, right? There's a lot of people that will never engage with your IP. There's a lot of people that as a board game, not everybody plays board game. And if all you do is make a board game, not everybody's going to engage with your IP. And so this just creates an importance to get everybody to do everything. I know when we first started out, Travis, really and started kind of pushing into board games a little bit, that was out of your comfort zone because you didn't really grow up playing sort of hobby style board games, right?
Yeah, I'm more was your typical Monopoly and Trouble.
Shoots and ladders.
You guys ever played Trouble?
Right, sure, yeah.
Oh yeah.
That game will break up a family. You send that person
Sure.
home. Oh, a lot of fights. But yeah, you're right. I was not into the board games.
But it was super interesting to see you sort of slowly sort of integrating that into, like one of our early projects, Fury, it was interesting to ultimately see your path to play board games, but that came through us developing music and a feature film script and all these different things. And eventually we got you to the point that you were excited to play these very Euro style board games, right? It was cool, but taking people directly to those to the hardcore stuff is typically some, it's not feasible because everybody has, especially in like an oversaturated entertainment environment, everybody has so many options that we all don't have to do the same thing anymore, and we all kind of carve out our own niche. I mean, it's shocking how many people that I meet, even as a professor, where I'll go teach at some universities. There's a lot of people in film school that never played video games. They don't play video games; they just watch movies. But at the same time, people in the music production programs, they don't watch movies. All they do is listen to music, and everybody kind of has their own thing. So if you're just single channel, you're going to reach a certain amount of people that do that thing. But what about all those other people, right?
Yeah.
If you have to look at it almost like gateway drugs.
Yeah, absolutely. And it takes me back real quick, Brad, I'll let you get in there. A real life example is, let me go back to my brother's Booty Bounce record mixed with Who Killed My Mama. He had a documentary that he had started. And I looked at some of it. I'm like, this is really cool. Documentaries, murder mysteries, they hit a very vast, wide audience, black,
Sure.
white, young, old, right? So he could put that out on YouTube and people are going to be interested. I saw people watching things about our case across in Europe. It got that far out, news pieces, right? I said, you can put that out. That's brilliant. I said, if your album, instead of, he had some hits on his album, but I said, but if the whole album tells the story of what led you up to the point of making the documentary, your story, how things turn bad, you can get some of these old Caucasian 50-year-olds, white, black, whatever, people who don't even listen to hip hop to say, this is so intriguing. I want to find out about this guy. But they say that he tells the story of his life in the album that led up to this. And there you got these different people and demographics listening to a hip hop album who would have never listened to it. And that's why having that story and having those entry points can help you sell what you make, because maybe his album was what we call the driving platform, what you really wanted to get the eyeballs on. I said, well, this is a way to do it. And I was trying to get him to let us map that out for him.
Sure.
And he had gotten too far with it and just didn't want to. But that's how we have to be thinking.
100%.
Yeah, I think that what you're hitting on is it's the business strategy of it. You know? And so it kind of gives you a better shot of getting these stories and the messages that you have out there and letting them thrive in the market, you know? So
Exactly.
if you're designing and creating for these multiple demographics, like you're saying, using different entry points, then you're giving yourself a better chance to let that story live on and grow and be successful, you know? And it's not just the personal success you're chasing, it's the success of the project. You know?
100%, man.
So that's if you truly believe in it, you put in your heart in what you're creating. Now you're giving it a chance to actually get out there and grow and engage a lot of different people.
You're 100% right, Brad. And because, you know, in film, at least, there's this old Hollywood term called the 4-quadrant picture, right? And the 4-quadrant picture is simply a movie that people put out that everybody goes to see. And so, you know, traditional Hollywood breaks everybody up into 4 basic quadrants, right? I mean, we have you're either male and female, or you're old and young, right? And you're old and young. So your 4 quadrants are like old ladies, young girls, old dudes, or young guys, right? And so so typically when you make a movie, create an album, write a book, you pick a quadrant or maybe 2 quadrants to kind of really go after, and that's your target market. But a 4-quadrant picture is that blockbuster, right? That Toy Story, that Fast and the Furious movie, the Hunger Games, that thing that everybody goes to see, like you know the you know, Taylor Swift, Michael Jackson in music, right? Like those things that everybody just does. And if you can hit the 4-quadrant picture, or the 4-quadrant album, or the 4-quadrant book, or whatever it is, that's the golden goose. That's the holy grail, the golden goose, dating the prom queen. That's like hitting the lottery. That's the windfall that you want. But traditionally, if you talk to people in Hollywood, it's a fool's errand to try to engineer that 4-quadrant picture. It's very difficult. The only people that's really figured out how to engineer it is Pixar, and we can talk about that on a separate podcast. But it's you know, they've released 23, 24 movies, and like 21 of their 24 have been #1 at the box office, made $500 million. And so out of 24 at bats, they've hit 21 home runs, which is absolutely incredible. So they've figured out something that I think, you know, was worthy of a separate discussion. But traditionally, people say, if you try to engineer the 4-quadrant picture, because old ladies like different things than young girls. So like old ladies like mystery and intrigue, and young girls like romance and, you know, stuff like that. Young guys like sex and fart jokes, and old guys like history and war and things like that, right? I think I've equally offended everybody.
You nailed it.
Yeah. So
call me old. Thanks.
Yeah. So generally that's how we break down. And so being able to create one story on purpose that checks all those boxes, typically it feels forced. It's not authentic. It just feels like engineered studio crap that everybody.
Yeah, like, wait, why is this love story entering my war picture? Like,
and we feel it, we can tell it, and we can recognize it. Like, oh my gosh, like I know exactly why you did that. You're pandering to this other thing, and it's just like it just creates, from an art level, it just creates this friction that typically audiences push against. And so what the typical wisdom is now is to go after your 1 quadrant, pick your 1 quadrant, and then hope and pray to the little baby Jesus that it grows into 4 quadrants, right? And if that's like Game of Thrones, very much a hardcore 1 quadrant TV show, but it grew into a 4 quadrant thing, right? Most don't, but that's sort of the wisdom. But if you go after 1 quadrant and you're a mere mortal, not a Game of Thrones, you're just like a mere mortal like everybody else, that remains 1 quadrant. The problem is, that 1 quadrant project may be good, but it's bad business because we left those other 3 quadrants out in the yard, not in our house, right? Like they could be paying customers, but they're not because we haven't given them an entry point. And so there's this seemingly interesting contradiction of, well, you're telling us to go after the 4 quadrants, but at the same time, you're not telling us to write the movie or the book or make the music that tries to go after 4 quadrants. So why are you contradicting yourself? I don't think it's a contradiction at all. I think what you do is you don't go after the 4 quadrants with one thing, right? I think you look at your IP as a broader 4-quadrant IP, and then say my entry point for young girls is maybe a web series. My entry point for old ladies is a book series. My entry point for old guys is a TV series, and my entry point for young guys maybe a mobile game or a video game or something like that, right? All of a sudden, you've created a 4-quadrant IP with a series of one quadrant products.
I think your driving platform, when you're selecting that, probably should hit at least a couple of quadrants.
Sure.
Like it's going to bring in a little bit larger of an audience. But yeah, it affords you to design your story world in a way where there's something for everybody.
Sure.
Everyone's coming in and playing, and then that allows them to explore and cross over into another area of a certain type of story that traditionally they would have stayed away from. But because they love the IP so much, they're going to be willing to go explore, something that traditionally maybe only old ladies are looking at. But
sure.
I want to go look at it because I love the story.
Because of the additive comprehension, right? Like this is the importance of additive comprehension, because it's not just creating multiple products, right? Just anybody can create separate products, right? Like who is it, Trev? 50 Cent that has vitamin water. He's on Power. He has his music, right? He plays a couple other things. Anybody can kind of diversify their brand, and there's reasons you want to diversify the brand. We talked about it before, but you want to diversify because of risk, right? You've increases your chance of success, but you've also diversified the risk. And if one thing doesn't work, then the success of the other things can maybe subsidize a loss. But the interesting thing is we want to create synergy between the products, right? Just because people drink vitamin water doesn't make them want to go watch Power, right? But if you can create the synergy between the products, then all of a sudden you get an exponential benefit that pops up. And so, like for me, I watch Star Wars cartoons just like I watch Star Wars movies. Typically, I don't watch cartoons for 10-year-olds. Right. I watch, adult things. I'm a grown man, so I watch adult things. And so, but I don't typically go and seek out cartoons, but I watch Star Wars cartoons that are targeted more like for kids like my little girl or your kids, Trav, targeted to them. I watch them because they extend my story. Right. But they also open Star Wars up to an entry point for a younger audience. Right, that as they get older, they'll flow over to the movies, right? Which means there are now more people who are watching the cartoons than if it was just young kids. It's young kids and old dudes, right? And more people that are watching the movies, old guys and young kids, and all of a sudden you get an exponential benefit in the audiences of each.
Yeah, and what's interesting, Brad, you mentioned you want those stories to hit a couple of quadrants if they can, and if they only hit one quadrant, you still want to make sure that the story, it all goes back to story, is inherently good, rich. You still have to because we're talking about manufacturing some things, guys.
Sure.
And so some people, that scares certain people out there saying like, I just want to be organic and just flow and have a stream of consciousness. You know how we get into that ethereal, esoteric thinking as artists, but no, you do have to have a very rich story. It comes down to that. But then it's okay to use your creative brain to manufacture how this story will fit in other quadrants, how this story will be connected, purposely making additive comprehension, purposely dropping what we call story seeds, saying something that's very poignant and stands out that you hit on, that grabs the listener's attention, but you purposely kind of spell that out and expound upon that in a different platform, in a different story, to make people cross over. So when we're talking about the super story, you have to use some super thinking and ingenuity and be clever about how you're tying things in. It's a real fun process.
And
it takes work.
Artists typically hate that, right? So for me, I'm like, I try to work on both sides of the brain, right? You get a pure artist that works on one side of the brain, that just feels so icky to them. But ultimately, what we're talking about is show business, right? We have the show, but we also have the business, right? And it goes together, and you have to have that strategic thinking, right?
Right.
Go ahead.
I think that's kind of why we really leaned into this, and wrote a whole book about it. Because as we were kind of breaking in and looking around at the landscape of entertainment, we had each of us had our different IPs that we loved to experience and enjoyed, and some were really successful and some weren't. And we really just took a holistic approach to analyze why.
Sure.
Why are people drawn to certain things? And we just kind of took an analytical approach, and spelling things out on a whiteboard. Okay, well, look, here's the pros and cons of doing this way. Here's the success stories. Here's the failure stories. And why is that? And then we just started developing this whole process, the super story process.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And
there were a lot of
as
fights.
we started, we argued it all out.
Sure.
And we got to the point where we can take an idea and now engineer, like you said, it doesn't feel artful when you say that, but you take a creative idea, you put it through these paces, you add in these certain characteristics, and what comes out of the other end is something that feels super rich. And yeah, it wasn't something that just popped in our head and we wrote it down. We actually engineered, but then at the end of the day, it's something that can connect to everybody, and it's a way to put that story in all these different avenues. So yeah, it is a combination of using an artistic creativity while you're using scientific logic in a way.
One of my favorite things that to always point to is in 1977, 76, two movies were released, same genre, same budget, same everything, which was Close Encounters of the Third Kind and Star Wars. One became a really good movie, did really well in the box office, and the other was a good movie, did well in the box office, but then became a 40, 50 year, $60 billion brand. And you have to think, what's the difference? Because I think artistically speaking, we can all look at Steven Spielberg, who shot Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and we could probably agree that Steven Spielberg is probably the more accomplished, I want to say accomplished, maybe the more artistic, the better filmmaker. Maybe just to say it that way.
Yeah.
I think he's the better filmmaker. I think he's a better writer, better producer, and probably a better director. And but you had disproportional success with Star Wars, right? Whenever you have two things that are so similar, and you have like disproportionate success with one, it's always good to look for the variable. What's the difference? I think it's just a good life skill to be able to say, okay, these two things were the same, they had different results. Why? Right? Try to have that analysis there. Like, North Korea, South Korea, same country, same population, same climate, same everything. A wild amount of prosperity in South Korea, and wide amounts of just like devastating poverty in North Korea. What's the difference when everything's the same? Well, the difference is freedom, right? Totalitarianism versus freedom and liberty, right? And that begins to expose principles that I think you need to expose. So the same thing with Close Encounters and Star Wars. And why did George Lucas have, I don't want to say George Lucas had disproportionate success, but the IP had disproportionate success over and above Steven Spielberg. And when someone asked Steven Spielberg this in a book that I read recently, and the author asked Steven Spielberg, why do you think Star Wars outperformed Close Encounters when Close Encounters was probably a better movie? And he said two reasons. George always had a bigger vision than just a single story from day one.
Awesome.
Right? He had a bigger vision. And two, he created a story world that people wanted to explore. He said, I always looked at Close Encounters as a single story, and I didn't even give a thought about the story world. All I wanted to do was tell a story about these characters. And so Steven Spielberg himself credited Star Wars' disproportionate success with big vision, great story world, right? Which then created sort of these launching point. But then there's a third thing that I always like to point to. And I read this book called How Star Wars Conquered the Galaxy, and it really kind of gives a forensic breakdown of the IP of Star Wars. And when George was a kid, he never wanted to be a filmmaker. His childhood dream was always to be an architect. And so when every month or every summer he would go and work in his dad's toy shop, right, and his toy store. And so when ultimately he got to filmmaking in college, he entered filmmaking with the mind of an architect and a really good understanding of how toys work, right? And all of a sudden he hit it from that different angle, and all of a sudden you see sort of this disproportionate. And that's the way Steve Jobs and or Jay-Z, any of them, these people that scale their stuff so much, they always hit it from different angles.
Right.
But ultimately, from a story perspective, from just a pure artistic perspective, if I invest into a story, I want my story to keep living on. I love my characters. I love my story. I love the stuff, right? I don't want it to necessarily end with just a single thing. But there's so many filmmakers out there, especially filmmakers, but it's not just filmmakers, some like artists in any capacity that will fight us for their right to just tell the one-off story.
Yeah, I want to ask them sometimes out of frustration and shake them. Why are you writing? You want your voice to be heard. You want your stories to be heard. You want them to go out to the world, other than just your grandma and your dad and your sister in a living room setting. You said, hey, I got this. So do something. It takes more artistry, higher level of thinking to do this super story thing. And if people really love art, they'll love that challenge. They'll love that push. Get out of your comfort zone. If you're comfortable, that's mediocrity. So let's try and help all of you get those stories out by making some adjustments, slight edging it, doing a little bit more than in the beginning, setting that groundwork. I mean, I challenge everybody because I'm an artist. I've written tons of things and performed, and I loved it better when I performed with New Kids on the Block and there was 24,000 screaming girls, rather than when I would perform for the 5 people who showed up at my local coffee shop. Now I still perform because I liked it, but something about the 24,000 did something to me.
Sure, of course, right? No, it's such an interesting thing. Go ahead, Brett.
I think the awesome part about the super story process that we've developed is it really fosters collaboration. And so kind of like what Travis was saying, it's like there's a lot of artists that, they're just focused on the one story. And a lot of times because they're just themselves, they're just looking at it as working on themselves. And so they want to put time into something, get it out, and then move on and do something different. But what's great about this process is it kind of helps lay out how you can use different people in the process and really execute on a larger level. And so it's not just you trying to do it all yourself, and then it's overwhelming.
Yeah, it's like our company. What's funny is like how we even developed with me being in a music background, Houston writing, directing, you Brad directing and writing, and even some of our brand guys who are just strictly brand. It's really cool. And if you're an individual, collaboration. I mean, it's cliche as power numbers, cliche. It takes a village, but it really does. People are looking to collaborate who have different skill sets than you, and you'd be amazed of who would want to lend something here and there and be 100%. A part of something greater. I think that's what makes us kind of cool and unique. We actually get to work together every day, but have these different mindsets and skill sets within entertainment. So,
and I tell you, if we're very cliquey, just as human beings, but filmmakers, like directors, they tend to hang out with a lot of directors. Screenwriters hang out with screenwriters. Music producers hang out with other music producers. If you broaden your scope of just who you hang out with and collaborate with, I mean, I think more music producers should hang out with screenwriters, and more screenwriters should hang out with playwrights, and more playwrights, hang out with board game people. I think like the more you do that, the more you're going to open yourself up to these types of collaboration. But I think even beyond the collaboration, I don't think I've ever met someone who's only good at one thing. And especially in today's culture, we're all good at a couple different things, right? And what I always tell people is even if you can't find collaborators right now, pick 3 things that you're good at, right? Like, I know you're a screenwriter, I know you're a novelist, that's your one thing, right? But what else can you do? Right? Are you a painter on the side? Do you know how to make a website? Are you a photographer? Right? I mean, now like everybody can kind of make a website. Everybody can shoot photos to put it on Instagram. Like, we're all good at different things. And I always say, pick 3. Just pick the 3 things that you do. So if you're a filmmaker and a poet and a painter, right? Now your filmmaking may be your number one thing, but you're a hobby poet and a hobby painter and took a master class somewhere and can know how to paint. Then every movie that you make, you should make the movie, have a pop-up art exhibit of paintings that extend the story of the movie, and release a book of poetry either through social platforms or actual book on Amazon that extend the story of both your paintings and your movie. And then all of a sudden you have a multi-platform super story that you never had to go outside of yourself to even create. It just leans itself into your own strengths, and you begin to brand yourself as the filmmaker that does these other things, right? So then if you take that and then add a couple other components through cross-platform collaboration outside of your own skill set, now you have something really super special. I think people get too tripped up in the head about like it seems too difficult and insurmountable, but I think it's a lot more practical than people think.
And then the other analogy we always use is to kind of designing a blueprint for a house.
Sure.
So running through the super story process, you can lay out and plan how you're going to expand the IP over a period of time. Not that you have to do it right away. You can plan it out, look at what are those stories and platforms that maybe are a little bit more longer term. So then you focus on the other side of it. You build that small little kitchen area first before you're going to build that giant great room.
But you have the big vision though. You know how, because when you go do the great room, you know how the plumbing connects and the electrical connects, right? And it doesn't feel tacked on after the fact, right? It's going to be organic growth as you scale. I think that's
it's not the end result after a period of years is not like a Pueblo community of just these like misshapen houses crammed together. It's you'll see that giant vision taking shape, and it's fluid.
But absolutely, because if you think about how a house building, sometimes when people go to remodel houses, which you can retroactively create a super story, you can just run into little snags, and you got to work through them. Like when you do a house, I watch a lot of HGTV with my wife. She forces it down my throat. It's crazy. But I've learned that sometimes they'll put a support beam within the foundation. If you move that wall, the whole house collapses. So they have to come back and do all these things. But if you build your vision saying, I'm probably going to expand. I'm not going to put that beam right there because later on I'm adding this bathroom or stretching this kitchen now when I can afford to do that. That's how you have to think of your story. And what's that scripture? I wish I could remember it. Brad, you may know it about the tents, like what they're talking about
Expand
in
your
the Bible.
Tents, right?
Expand
your tents.
Yes.
He told them to do that so that he knew that they were going to grow, whatever that situation they were in. That's that scripture that brings to mind about super story.
Sure. Right. I mean, it's even when you start with an acorn, the acorn eventually grow into the oak tree. Right. And, we're talking about organic growth, right? Not engineered growth. And, but I think like for me, the pushback I get is when people say, listen, not every story needs it needs to be a super story. Not every story needs to be more than one thing. There are some dishes that are best served, as singular things. And from an artistic level, I know what people are trying to say, but I think ultimately that's selfish. I think ultimately for an artist to say, you only need one story, then and that's all that you deserve as an audience. And what they're really saying when they say this story doesn't need to be anything more, they're saying their audience doesn't need anything else, and their investors don't need any more revenue, and neither one should ever be true.
Yeah,
right. I mean, so you have one of the most precious things in life. Is for someone to say, I believe in your dream and your vision so much, I'm going to give you my hard-earned money to be able to execute that vision. And that is such a powerful, important thing. You have, I think, not just a fiduciary duty to get that person a return on their investment. I think you have a moral and ethical obligation to bless that person for the rest of their life, right? Yeah. And for you to say, you know what, I think there's another opportunity to bring more revenue to the brand, to get you a better investment or return on investment for you. But because of my artistic sensibilities, I think we shouldn't pursue that because I just want my story to be one thing. That is kind of a crappy jerk thing to do.
For one, I love the word fiduciary. Is
Sure.
that how you say it?
That's
That's a pretty cool word for a legal term. Two, guys, hey, one, let's go back to the beginning. Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood. Get your story out there. And two, that scripture was, if you like the wisdom of God, which I do, Isaiah 54 verse 2, enlarge the place of your tent, stretch your tent curtains wide. Do not hold back. Lengthen your cords. Strengthen your stakes. Do that from the beginning. Be willing to grow. Get out of the comfort zone.
Right? Because ultimately, listen, guys, my biggest thing, like there's a business model things that excite us about Superstory. They're about exponential increases in revenue and getting different demographics. Like at the end of the day, if you are passionate about your project and you're saying something important about your project, you want your project to become all things to all people. You want your project to be able to, your message to be able to reach as many people as you can. I mean, I look at something like Fruitvale Station. Fruitvale Station is such a powerful film, right? That has such a powerful message about racism and police brutality and sort of all these cultural things that are imbued in it. It's a great film. I love it. But because I know so many people that don't watch movies, they will never hear the message that is carried by Fruitvale Station. Right? They'll never. The kids that play video games 13-hour days never watch movies. And if they do, it's just a comic book movie. They'll never hear that. The people that just listen to music, that just play board games, that don't watch movies, they'll never hear that message. And so, for you to say that because of your artistic sensibility as a filmmaker, you don't want to go make a board game, that is intrinsically, that's really you saying the people that play board games don't need to hear the message of racism and police brutality. People that play video games don't need to hear that. And I'm because my artistic sensibility doesn't lean itself to that.
And I think that's, and something that we'll get into in a future podcast is something we call the soapbox.
Sure.
So yeah, every story that you put out there, make sure it does have that message that you're passionate about, and instead of just, oh, here's an idea that's kind of cool, before we're running with that and creating it, and then it fizzles out because there's not a real engine behind it. Take a little time up front, engineer, okay, this is the type of thing that is attracting me right now to create something.
Sure.
So let me really think it through. What is at the heart of this message?
Right.
And how can I really make sure every part of my story that in the execution is speaking to that message? And that's what, like you said, that's going to get you passionate about it because it's something that you're connected to, and it's going to really fuel the creativity. And then now you're putting something out there that other people are feeling that passion, and they're seeing the good in that message that you're trying to get out there, and that's going to really draw people to your projects.
I mean, guys, we could talk about obviously we could talk about Superstore for hours. I mean, we're obviously passionate about this stuff, and there's a lot of reasons why. But hopefully, this kind of gives people a primer. We're going to keep talking about it. We're going to keep talking about it. We're going to keep talking about it because I think, especially in a post-COVID Hollywood, in a democratized society that we have as far as technology, Superstore is now becoming more important than ever, especially for independent creators, especially for organizations that want to lean into sort of a different model of communication. And I think this is going to be a big deal. So we're going to keep producing content. Check out our books. If you haven't read our books, if you want to do more of a deep dive, you're going to need a bigger story. Make your story really stinking big. Check out our website at superstory.works.
Can we end it? People are going to get mad at me, but I think this is good. We're going to end it how we started it. Here's what I want to say to everyone. My last note is really quick. If you never try and take great opportunities or allow your dreams to become realities, you will never unleash your true potential, and the world will never benefit from what you could have achieved. So voice your ideas. Don't be afraid to fail, and certainly don't be afraid to succeed. Your playing small does not serve the world. So quote I just read.
So you just Trav just purchased a quote book over the weekend, apparently.
Yeah, I did.
I love that. It's their go-to.
They're just spilling out. I can't help it. I can't.
So I'll end with a quote as well. Pete Rose once said, "You'll never steal second with your foot on first." So Just pray about
Love it.
that. That's
Super
it.
story.
Right? That's
Be
it.
super, guys. Be super.
That's it. That's it. P Rose was super. So listen, y'all, thank you guys so much for hooking up for our Zoom session conversation about the power of Superstory. If you're listening on podcast or if you're watching the video, check out our website, superstory.works. There's a lot of content there that you guys could absorb, and we look forward to bringing it back again next week in the Superstory Vidcast, the Zoom sessions. Thanks, guys.
All right.